Welcome to our webinar and the virtual launch of our yearbook. I'm going to put my head to the side a bit so you can see the virtual launch of our yearbook, which came out 5-6 weeks ago through the blood, sweat, and tears of our team, to whom you'll all be introduced very soon. My name is Kesia Rust, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Affordable Housing Finance. And we're really so happy to have everybody here today. It's such a great opportunity. I mean, this is the 15th yearbook. And so we've done it for the last 15 years, which is longer than CAHF's actually been in existence. Some of you may have been there from the very, very beginning. And a lot have come on since then. It started with about 3 or 4 people involved in the beginning. And now we've got how many, Alison? I think something like 70 or something. So it's become this remarkable community of practice. And we're really so excited to be able to share it with you and to receive your feedback and your ideas and your critiques and your corrections and your insights. So I hope that today can be a bit of that kind of a discussion. And then we will take all of those things that you say and that we think of as we're saying into our minds as we go forward and plan for the next year. So let me welcome all of the people on the panel. And then what I thought I would do is give a presentation that sets out the overall approach and ideas that were put in the introductory essay. And then we'll carry on with a panel discussion and opportunity to answer your questions and to hear your thoughts after that. So if I can ask my panel to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with you, Alison Changana.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is lovely to see all of these familiar names and faces here today. So thank you very much for making the time. My name is Alison Changana. I have been the chief editor for the yearbook for the last 7 years, I think. It's been a while. This is as Kesia said, this is our 15th edition, and I think it's my 6th or 7th yearbook. But I am supported by a fantastic team. So I'm going to hand over to you, Claudia, for the next introduction.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks, Kesia. And hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. This is definitely the moment I've thought of probably the most for the last few months. I'm Claudia Hitzerath, and I'm the project manager for the English version of the yearbook. And this year was my first year on the yearbook team. And the journey that it was to put together this book, and it is just really great to have been working with this team and to have the yearbook on my lap right now. And it was absolutely great also to work alongside Aminata, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. That's a nice transition. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aminata Barrow. I'm an urban planner working in Senegal, from Senegal. And I have been working on the management of the Francophone yearbook for 2 years now. And before that, I was working as an editor to the yearbook. So when I started, I just fell in love with the book, and now my life is tied to it like indefinitely. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to have the same hard copy of the Francophone yearbook as Claudia has very soon. So we'll discuss it and we'll talk about that later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aminata. Makafui.
Hello, my name is Makafui Abunakufu. I'm the profile author for Ghana. I've done the profile authoring for the past 2 years. I did for last year and I did for this year as well. I'm a real estate consultant in Ghana and happy to be on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Makafui. James. James, would you like to introduce yourself? Okay, maybe we'll find James when we get closer to that section of the agenda. And also on the screen, we have Tandiwe Dlamini. If you'd like to just say hi, Tandiwe is the program manager of the African Union for Housing Finance. And she doesn't have a microphone today, but it's lovely to see you. Okay, let me take us through a bit of just an overview of the thinking behind the issues in the yearbook this year. And then we'll move on to the rest of the agenda. Thanks so much. And please, everyone, feel free to put your questions and thoughts and ideas into the chat. Can I invite the panelists to keep the chat open and just scan it so that when we have the panel discussion, you might want to respond to some of the issues that are raised. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. And there we go. Can everybody see? Can I have a thumbs up?
Yes,
from
we
someone?
can see.
Okay, thank you so much, Aminata. Excellent. So this is our 15th edition, which seems sort of significant, and that is happening within our 10th year. If you haven't already downloaded it, you can with the QR code on the top right there. It's also quite nice. You can send that along to whoever you like, and they can download it. This year, the theme that felt to me to emerge as I looked through the profiles and thought about what the overview essay would address and cover is a sort of tension that exists within our cities across the continent, where there's the things that we write about and read about and what our governments govern, and then there's the way it happens in real life. And so the theme this year of the overview essay is about cities that think fast and slow, and that you've got these different paces that are underway all the time. So our agenda will have our panel discussion, and then please do put together some questions and thoughts so that we can have an open discussion with everybody in the room. Really looking forward to hearing your insights. So this part, I mean, you all know this, right? Cities are central to the growth of our economies. And at the center of this is housing. Very, very exciting that the new executive director of UN Habitat, Ana Claudia Rosbach, has articulated directly that housing is at the center of what we're trying to do within our cities. And in that context, she also recognizes informality as a very significant part of that, and something that we need to address and recognize. So what we do find, though, and you've seen this, everyone has seen this, wherever you drive, give you 5 minutes to leave your home, maybe even less, you will come across some level of informality that's happening in the city. And it really is a challenge to all of us to start to count and to read and to recognize this. So here we've got some photographs. We've done work in Nairobi, Kenya. We're about to start a project, in fact, with the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy on the second and third photographs in the middle at the top. It's an area called Pipeline, and we're so curious about what's happening in that neighborhood in terms of the flow of money and how that shapes the housing experience and the quality of housing that's being developed, often under the radar of the local authorities. But there is capital that's being invested there. You can see in the photograph on the far left in Nairobi that cities are multifunctional. They have so many different land uses happening side by side, but sometimes also on top of one another, where you've got shops, retail, commercial, industrial, together with your residential, and that's often just organic. We're doing a project at the moment in Kigali in Rwanda, and that area that's highlighted there, that's one property. Just look at how many units are on that property. And there are, I think, 22 people living there. 7 people are the household themselves, and then the remainder are tenants living in rental accommodation from which the owner earns revenue. Then there's also commercial units on that property, and all of that is happening and sustaining the household who lives there. So that's significant. The photograph on the bottom left is Maputo, Mozambique. And those are properties that were being developed by a company called Casaminia. But they were working, so that's not informal, it is formal, but it's very small scale. They were working plot by plot by plot. The picture in the middle on the bottom, that's DRC, and you can just see the way the city sprawls out. And that's scale, there's scale delivery there, but it's 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, where everybody is a developer in that context. And that's an interesting effort to monitor and engage with. Then finally, the picture on the right is a formal development in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, that ran into funding problems. And the development wasn't finished. So we've got a whole lot of informal housing that's happening. And then we also have formal housing that sometimes isn't always as successful as we hope it to be. So in the yearbook and in the original essay, you know, as you know, we collect data from across the continent. And this year we had a fabulous data team who, and I'm sure Alison will share with you how that was done, but who collected data. They're based in Johannesburg, but they collected data across the continent. And then that was supplemented by data that was provided by the authors. So we took the data of the urban population living in slums, and that's coming from the World Bank. The same data is available also at UN Habitat. It's only from 2020. And we know that informal settlements are changing on a, you know, at least a monthly basis, probably weekly, probably daily in some instances. So this is just indicative. And then we look at the percentage of households with access to basic services, and you can see there's a correlation. Each are the flip side of the other. Now, how do we understand this? And what does it mean when we're talking about an SDG about people living in slums? And is that a services issue? Is that a housing issue? There's a whole lot more underneath these numbers that we need to investigate and understand better. The number that was collected by our data team that struck me the most, however, was this. And here we put together data from different sources. But basically, we took unemployment data, so that's blue, from the IMF, World Bank, and African Development Bank, and it's dated between 2016 and 2024. Then we took informal employment data from the ILO, from the International Labour Office, and that data is between 2014 and 2023. Putting those together, we made the assumption that the remainder must be formally employed because we didn't have that number. So looking at it that way, we got these graphs, this graph, these bars. And what struck me most is that our policies and products and all of the effort we do is designed for the green, for the formally employed, and for the unemployed. That's the way we imagine our worlds. And yet the majority of activity and the majority of the population is living in the orange, people who are informally employed. So what does that mean for the design of our financial products and services, the way in which housing is going to be developed and built over time, and so on? It's a critical issue that we need to understand. As you all know, every year, CAHF collects data on the cheapest newly built house, and we ask the yearbook profile authors to tell us what is the cheapest newly built house built by a developer or a contractor within the context of a development. I think it is over 20 units in an urban area. Not everyone can give us the answer to that question. And it's remarkable how difficult it is to find. Some countries have property websites. There's Buy Rent Kenya, there's Property 24 in South Africa, and so on. A number of countries have that. But they are often targeted at higher income earners. And so the online advertising isn't always of the cheapest available unit. There aren't central data sources that you can access data on what kind of units are being produced. So we got new data this year, I think from about 25 countries. And otherwise, we've highlighted the data from previous years. So this year, 2024 data, the cheapest newly built house was found in Kenya. It's part of the Pangani development, which is in Nairobi, and that's part of the affordable housing program. So it's offered for sale on the private market, but it is subsidized. A weakness in our data collection around this is that subsidies are not transparent. So we can't always tell if the cheapest newly built house is a commercial offering or if it's a subsidized offering. That's a difficult thing to tell, something we need to sharpen in the years going forward. Also, is that house is in a development where, or house or unit, it could also be a unit like a flat or an apartment, but that unit is in a development that maybe includes, well, we say at least 20, maybe it's 100, maybe even 1,000 units. But that's not enough to serve the population within that context. So that's another issue to think about, is how widespread is this unit? And it also doesn't contemplate the availability of finance to be able to access it. So the question is, are these units affordable? We took the data from the World Bank's International Comparison Program from 2021, and we looked at average annual household expenditure, and they very usefully distinguish between expenditure on housing-related expenses and expenditure on non-housing related expenses. And so you add the two together and you should get total expenditure, and that's on an annual basis in this graph. And expenditure is what we're using as a proxy for income. Very difficult to gather data or to get data that's accurate on income because of the way in which all of us report on income. We forget bits, but expenditure is often more reliable. So that's been used here as a proxy. And then what we did is we took the price of the cheapest newly built house and we considered that as a multiple of annual household income, and generally annual household expenditure, which we're using as a proxy for income, and that gives us our house price to expenditure ratio. And generally it should be between 2 and 3, so that the price of your house should be between, or is understood normally to be between 2 and 3 times your annual income. Is that true? Think about it, your own situation. It's just a gauge. But when we look at it here, and we're looking at the scale on the right-hand side, which is that ratio, the cheapest newly built house as a multiple of annual household expenditure. And I've circled the number 5, and it's below that you want to be. So there are a bunch, but you want to be at 2 or 3, and we've got quite a few that are at the top of that. And then in a lot of countries, the cheapest newly built house is actually much more than the average annual household expenditure. And so there's a real affordability issue here. And again, remember that cheapest newly built house is built by a developer within the formal system. So what it tells us is that that formal system, whether in terms of scale or in terms of price, is not meeting the affordability requirements of the population. Okay, we knew that, right? That's why we're all here. But here we have the data that helps us understand that a little better. And that's what we're trying to do in the yearbook. And each one of the country profiles explores that in a different way. Lots of people in the past year have been talking about the impact of inflation. And sure, Zimbabwe, 561%. So this is data that is coming. It's not on my slide, my apologies. I think it's coming from the World Bank, but maybe, Alison, you can correct me when we get to the panel discussion if I've got it right or wrong. And we took the inflation rate as well as the material cost inflation rate. So the general consumer price index inflation, and then specifically for building materials. And for building materials, that data wasn't available for all countries. It was just for a few countries. But you can see that often it's higher than regular inflation. Inflation has been significant, over 10% in all of those countries on the right-hand side. You can see the 10% is the first line, horizontal line. And look how many countries have inflation rates above that. but even above 5%, for goodness sakes. And then Senegal, Aminata, maybe you want to comment on that. I have no idea what's happening with building cost inflation in Senegal. So that's an important issue to think about around affordability. This year, Alison and her team asked the yearbook authors, the country profile authors, to provide an example of a development that was happening, an affordable development that was happening in their country. And I think they were guided a little bit towards rental, but we got quite a range. And I don't know if you can see at the top of the screen, we've classified them just in terms of points of interest. So the first column is, are the projects government subsidized, or are they social housing? A lot of them were. Or are they commercial developments? Or are they cooperative NGO self-construction examples? Are they public-private partnerships? Do they involve rental or rent-to-own or ownership? Maybe they're mixed-use residential estates. There's an interesting example of rehabilitation from Equatorial Guinea. Modular construction in the DRC, examples of green build, examples of financing from the diaspora, focused target on to civil servants, and then a lesson in poor practice where a project didn't go so well. And those are always useful. A bit embarrassing to sometimes report that, but so critical that we actually know that, because that's how we're going to learn about what it was. And in the Angola case, it was about market targeting. It was designed for a particular target market, but was no longer affordable for that target market. So we had this for all 54 countries. Here it's a little bit smaller, more difficult to read, but I'm sure you can find it in the yearbook directly. All of these examples are worth looking into a little bit further, and I'm sure that you'll be curious about some of the ones in the countries that you're familiar with. It's this big on each page. It's a paragraph. We want to know so much more. We want to know about how long it took, how much it cost, who it was targeted at, and who eventually got it. What was the level of subsidization? What was the type of subsidization? How long it took to sell or to dispose of, and so on. We want to know everything. And a colleague, Alan Matuma in Kenya, he's our program manager for the Open Access Initiative. And we're starting to ask these kinds of questions of developers, specifically in Kenya, but we're also moving to Nigeria, and in fact, to any country where a developer is happy to give us their data, to measure what is the price of the product all the way down to like the brick, so that we can understand ratios and relationships between land, infrastructure, and so on. What is the process, the steps, time, and cost? What is the performance of the development over the long term? Who are the people who are benefiting from it or who are involved in it? And then what are the practices that are followed? So those 5 Ps are being explored by the Open Access Initiative. And if that's something of interest, I would urge you to reach out to Alan or reach out to me, and I'll put you in touch with him to find out more about that as we try and get into the detail of specific projects, which I'm sure when you go through the yearbook, you'll see that they're really interesting. But they just whet your appetite. It's not enough to really understand whether this is significant, has a big impact, or so on. A big thing, none of these projects are meeting demand as it exists. None of them are big enough. None of them are actually dealing with the breadth of what we actually need. So we need to think about that as well. Okay. And that's something that hit us as an organization over the last year as well, is that when you look at census data, for example, as we did in Kenya, together with colleagues at 71.4, and this was a project that, in fact, we did with the World Bank a year ago. When we compared 2 years of census, 2009 and 2019, the level of delivery that was suggested by the census was completely different from what the government says it's delivering on an annual basis. So the government says 50,000 residential units are being delivered per annum. Well, just in rental, there are 3.67 million urban households who rent, and that number between 2009 and 2019 grew by 1.6 million, which is about 160 or 158,000 households per annum, versus households who said that they owned, that grew by 39,000 units per annum. Of that 158,000 new urban renter households per annum, or let's say the total number, the 3.67 million, 89% of them say that they rent from an individual. So that's all happening beneath the radar. And these are two pictures of this area pipeline in 2003 and in 2022, where you can see massive growth that's happening. And it's happening not as part of the formal delivery system. So as I was thinking about all of this that's happening, and I'm sure many of you know that what we try and say at CAHF is that we want to be real. We want to reflect what's happening like in real life, to understand where are the gaps around finance and where are the gaps in delivery that we can address. And I was inspired by this book, or have been for many years, by Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, even though he was a psychologist. He's since passed away. I highly recommend this book. Thinking Fast and Slow. It has nothing to do with housing. It has to do with how our brains work. And basically, he argues that in our brains and the way in which we operate as human beings on this planet, we operate both fast and slow. Fast, we are intuitive, we're quick, we make our decisions fast, often based on experience, kind of the way you shift gears in your car. You don't think about it, it just happens. That's fast thinking. And then there's slow, where you're deliberate and logical and you think through things, and you have to collect your evidence and your data. And those two things happen simultaneously in our brains. And sometimes they cause us to make mistakes. Bias interferes with that and so on. So, and if we value one over the other, we end up losing out, because they actually have to work together. And that's what I took as a metaphor in thinking about our cities, that we need our cities to be fast and slow. So they are fast. They have informal settlements that are popping up all the time. They've got people making plans and hustling and earning an income on street corners or through 7 different means of revenue, all within the space of their month. They're getting their money from different places. It's happening fast. It's responsive to the environment. It's a bit overwhelming sometimes, but that's how people are surviving. It's also worth noting that politics is often, I think, on the fast side. It's responding to the electorate, not always thinking about the long-term plans that are within the city. And that, I would argue, is on the slow part of the deliberate, careful policy making that we do and that we want our cities to do. That's based on data, based on information. And that's deliberate. But if that process of slow thinking is not supported by the data that comes from the fast activities, we stand to undermine the development process. And that's when we create this split between what we call formal and so-called informal. When in fact, if we brought the two together, we might have a better way of leveraging the capacities of each for the successes of the others. An important opportunity in that, of course, is technology, because technology is able to capture what's happening, is able to, we see, for example, through digital platforms, suddenly you can know about something that is, the digital platform collects all of this information, which otherwise would have been only known through word of mouth, and you can get a sense of a whole marketplace that's operating. And there are so many different examples, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, of how technology is facilitating and enabling the quicker movement of urban development and of housing development and its financing. And throughout the yearbook, there are a number of examples. We also have a newsletter series that my colleague David Chiwetu, he's a research manager at CAHF, he's been putting that out, interviewing prop tech providers and recording how they are contributing to the housing value chain, what particular niche they're looking at. So paying attention to technology as a way of changing our thinking and bridging the fast and the slow is something that's then suggested, and that comes up in different places through the profiles as well. The thing that we struggle most with when we talk about the so-called informal, the definition of informal is that it's not enumerated. We can't see it. That's why we call it informal, because it isn't logged and therefore regulated in any particular way. And a point made in a different webinar today actually was that with mobile money, now everything is logged, even if it's an informal transaction. If it's done through a cell phone, suddenly it's there. So I've been really interested in the work that SDI does with their, so that's Shack Dwellers International, and they have federations in the countries that are listed in this map. And then also, and those federations, they've got a national bodies and then local area-based federations that operate as savings groups and housing advocacy groups. But one of the things that they've been doing is collecting the data on who is their membership, who are saving. And that data is so important because there you can start to see some of the informal, so-called informal activity and the money that's flowing, and that might enable housing development. So I think there's some important work there to be done. I would encourage all of those in the countries that are listed here where SDI has offices to engage with them around the data to see if that might help you better understand your market in your country. And at WOOF, earlier this month, we had a panel discussion where we had someone from Namibia, from the affiliate in Namibia, the Affordable Housing Action Group there. And really their understanding of how to collect the data from the membership and then share that back into a market that needs that data to make investment decisions really deserves additional support. And what we really need is that when you can start to see something, a regulator or a commercial provider of a product or whatever, then you can start to trust it. And what we need is to trust the informal rather than just falsely trusting the formal, and finding a way to bring the two together to leverage their efforts so that we have more activity and possibility in the housing sector. And if that's the case, back to a point made by the ED of UN Habitat, then we can be very careful about where we target specific investments into affordable housing. Okay, so thank you to our editors, to Alison, to Claudia, to Aminata, and then to the entire team. And I hope you can read this very small slide, but it's also in the yearbook itself. We have so many people here, and we are so grateful for everybody's contribution. We really couldn't have done it without you, but especially to Alison for your leadership and your vision and making it happen and holding us all to deadlines. I speak from experience. And Claudia and Aminata for the 2 language versions. Thank you so much. I also want to very quickly shout out to the data team under the direction of Samu Ngubane, and they produced these beautiful infographics, well, the data that went into these beautiful infographics. And we're thinking about how do we do this over time, over the next few years. So there are infographics for each region that are there. And then lastly, to thank, well, 2 lasts. First last is to thank the sponsors and the people who advertised and provided support into the yearbook. This is hard and it's expensive because we're bringing in such a big team, but we think that it's really valuable. And so we're very grateful for everyone who provided their support in this. And then thank you to all of you for reading it and sharing it. We get the most hits on our website of any other product we get for the yearbook. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion. Alison, I'll hand over to you.
Hello, I'm just making sure I've unmuted myself. You should be able to hear me. Thanks very much, Kezia, for that overview. We've gone a little bit over our scheduled time, so I'm going to ask participants if it would be, we're going to, I think, go ahead until about 4:20, I think, so we can have some discussion with the panel and have some questions. If the panelists could turn their on. I think what we have in terms of our panel, can you not hear me?
We can't see you.
You can't see me. Yeah, it shows on my side that the video is working. Let me try again. Okay.
Alison, are you still there?
Can you?
Yeah, there you are.
Okay, can you see me? No.
We did for a second. Come back.
Sorry about that. Just when I start speaking, Zoom decides to censor me. I won't take it personally. Okay. So what we have in terms of our panel is we have our French editor, Aminata, as well as Claudia, who's been combing through all of the English profiles that were originally written in English, plus the authors from Rwanda and Ghana. So an experience from the author's perspective as well as the editor's perspective. And I just want to start with our two authors. And what I wanted to ask you is, as you were writing this year's profile, what stood out for you in terms of the developments in your country? Just a brief response on that. And certainly, Makafu, in your experience, you've written Ghana more than once. So are you seeing any changes from the 2 years that you authored the Ghana profile? And the third point would just be to ask if there are any recommendations or what kind of impact do you see the yearbook having in the residential property market and affordable housing space in your country? I'm gonna plead with you to please be fairly brief so that we can make sure that we have time for open questions as well as Aminata and Claudia. Should we start with
Okay.
Ghana?
Sure. Okay, thank you very much, Alison. For Ghana, I did make a lot of interesting findings. Talking of interesting findings, I did make a lot of interesting findings. However, I would like to highlight two key findings. Myself and my co-authors, Isaac Sampson and then Albert made. First is that this year in particular, we realized the extent to which the influence of Western cultures has actually impacted housing preferences. And even though this is typically of most African societies, Ghana has always been into the extended family system, which had influenced the dominance of the compound house system, or what we call the communal housing type. But this particular year, we realized that this is no longer the case, as housing preferences have actually shifted towards private arrangements, such as self-compound houses. And the figures have been very explicit. In fact, if you look at our past census data, we had compound houses dominating the supply of housing, with about 52.8% of housing supply being compound house. However, we realized a shift in trend in the sense that latest figures are indicating that, you know, detached housing is taking over and currently accounts for about 63.3% of housing supply. And so it actually means that, you know, communal housing is increasingly becoming unpopular across the country, and it just depicts how the supply market, the supply side of housing delivery has actually changed over the years. And the second is how much the increased cost of building materials has actually impacted affordability. You know, for instance, taking the bag of cement, I have seen the wholesale price of a bag of cement actually rising from approximately 70 cedis. That was in the past year where we authored the yearbook, to 79 cedis, which is a whole 9 cedis difference. And this is for the wholesale price, and I don't even want to talk about the retail price. So it clearly shows how, you know, the macroeconomic environment has influenced the price of building materials, which is constantly, you know, affecting the affordability of housing.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. That's really helpful. James, can we turn to Rwanda?
Sure thing. I hope you can hear me, Alison. Yes. I have had a chance to write about Rwanda twice, last year and also this year, together with my co-author, Grace Wanjira. And just to answer your questions on Rwanda, some interesting developments I've heard, I've also seen about Rwanda is the performance of the market, the housing market, despite the challenges in inflation and global macroeconomic challenges. So despite the interest rate has been quite stable, the last rate was there's been around 16 to 18% and has stabilized during that period, despite other countries such as Kenya, which have experienced a significant shift when it comes to interest rates. Also, to comment on Rwanda, Rwanda has been known as a country of pushing limits when it comes from a technical and digitization space. So, of course, there's the land tenure regularization program, which made Rwanda the first country to have all its property surveyed and adjudicated and titled, which is quite a unique factor. So they also stepped it up to include a billing permit system, which allows various players in the construction and property industry to tap in and also have a very seamless process when it comes to permits, when it comes to payments, which is a very significant issue and constraint when it comes to construction. When any player in the construction or housing industry can attest to that. There's also the e-titling system, which they launched last year, which any property owner can be able to access their title online. Of course, there's the issue of I call it property rights and property data access and all that. But the Ministry of Infrastructure have come through to create a tight system that allows I call it security of titling for almost every individual. Something also interesting is the formation of the Rwandan mortgage refinancing company. It's still in the works compared to other countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Tanzania, where the companies have already been formed. But this shows the need for housing and the need for affordability. Of course, for the Rwandan microfinancing company, talks are with the World Bank and also with Shelter Africa. Of course, it's not yet, the conversation is still ongoing, and talking about significantly reducing the interest rate to your typical family, typical individual from 17% to around 10, 11%, which is a significant drop when you look at the cost of financing and also the security that it offers to a household. So yeah, these are some of the interesting developments that I saw in Rwanda. Thank you, Alison.
It's a great summary of the highlights. Thank you, James. I'm going to turn to Claudia and Aminata. Perhaps we can start in Francophone Africa. And perhaps you can just highlight what stood out for you this year that you are seeing in the French authored profiles.
Thank you, Alison. Sorry. So this year, I feel like just like last year, a lot of the issues were quite common among the Francophone African countries. The main issue was the issue of land management, because the countries are still struggling to manage land due to the lack of decentralization. Sorry. The lack of decentralization of this capacity of this mission to manage efficiently the land systems. Also the price, as Kessia said, the price of the building materials, as we saw in Senegal, it has been rising very quickly due to the international context. All the African countries have been facing that. But I feel like in countries like Senegal, also the lack of industry, like the lack of industrialization of the country really impedes the capacity of the population or even the state or the private actors to get access to affordable building materials and thus to build the affordable housing. What also was blatant in the Francophone countries was the place that the informality takes in the economy and in the housing sector. So most of the housing, for example, in Senegal, as I was saying in the comments, in Senegal, more than 90% of the houses are built or self-built by the population with no technical assistance, most of the time with no title. So it raises a lot of issues in terms of how do the population also benefit from the asset that the house was supposed to represent when they do not have a title to then access to finance and be able to finish their building. It's quite interesting when you travel from Dakar and go outside of Dakar. When you look at the landscape, you see the buildings like in Dakar, they're all like completed. They have colors, they're painted. But the more you move outside of Dakar, the more they become gray. Like it's a really, it's a gradient of color that becomes grayer and grayer because the suburbs are the places that developed the last, like where people started to build very recently, and where the population who settled there went there for a reason, because the land is more affordable than inside of Dakar. So they have less means to finish their buildings, and the painting part is really not like a priority for them. So it's interesting to see also how the development of housing, the growth of the population can reflect in the urbanization of the cities and the countries. And it raises also the question of planification, because also as an urban planner, I cannot talk about housing without talking about planification, like urban planning. How do the lack of control from the government, the national government, and also the municipalities on the planning of the cities, of the land, is also a huge issue, because then the population settle in places where they were not supposed to build. Again, in Senegal, it's funny because in all of most cities, you have a neighborhood that's called Xaar Yalla. And that name, Xaar Yalla, it's Wolof, it means wait for God. So you settle there, you know it's messy, you know you're gonna have some issues at some point, but you just wait for God to someday show you that it wasn't a good idea. So people know, they're aware of that, but they have no other solution, because the available land is not managed efficiently by the governments and the local authorities as well. So I would say these are the main issues, like in terms of land, in terms of access to affordable materials. It's always quite the same issues. That's why this year when I was reading the profiles, I was thinking maybe we need to like I don't know, have new conversations in reviewing how the governments do their policies. Because when you look at the projects like that stand out, or even the projects that are implemented by the government, it's always the same kind of structure. Like they will always announce 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 housing project, but there's like it's a little bit marketing. Like we announced that we will build that many houses. You guys are happy because you know that there will be so many new houses in the country or in the city. But there's no further reflection on the targets, like the least well-off population that is not able themselves to build their houses. So eventually these programs end up being destined to people working like to civil servants, people from the middle class, like the high middle class, who could at some point have afforded a house by themselves with their own means. But yeah, I feel like it's also an issue, the distance between the targets, the understanding of the population of the market, of the way people actually live, what they can afford, their professional situation, things like that, and the policies that the government is willing to elaborate and implement. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Those are great insights. Thank you, Aminata. Claudia, from your angle, a little more south in the continent, what was standing out for you? I know this was your first year, so you're not going to see changes year to year, but what stood out for you in the profiles?
Absolutely. I think firstly to say that a lot of the trends that Aminata picked up in Francophone Africa is definitely echoed in all of the English-speaking countries that we were covering, so the rest of the continent. And it's something that we are seeing, particularly in kind of sub-Saharan Africa, though, is a policy shift towards increasing private sector delivery rather than your kind of mass housing programs that I think, Aminata, you referred to right at the end, 1,000 units, 100,000 units, the numbers vary widely. But what we are seeing or what I definitely picked up in a lot of different profiles that in terms of policy and where we're moving directionally there is an idea around unlocking the private sector. And then this question of, if you're unlocking the private sector to deliver affordable housing, how do we get the private sector to deliver into the affordable housing segment? And that was really also the thinking around the case study that we came up this year with, Aminata. So we asked authors, can you show us an actual housing development that's being built? And if possible, if you can find a rental housing example. But it was really around, the brief was, how low can we go? How low can the developer go? And are you seeing any developers that are managing to kind of deliver into the more low income and the more affordable brackets? And the case studies that we got back were resoundingly kind of middle income to upper income. And you can see what I'm getting to in that we're seeing a policy shift towards private sector and private sector delivery. But on the ground, we aren't necessarily seeing the formal affordable housing delivery really reaching this kind of like low income brackets that are the most in need and the most marginalized. On the flip side, what we see in nearly all of the profiles, and this is definitely my personal passion, so I was also making notes around it, is the importance of the informal rental sector, and that is also increasingly being more and more formalized. And that is what Kessia was referring to in the kind of Kenyan example, and it's becoming a really important conversation in South Africa. And it was really interesting. So the prevalence and the importance of backyard rental and a more informal urban rental, particularly in cities and for housing delivery for the kind of lowest income segments in locations that are close to jobs. That was mentioned in Zimbabwe, it was mentioned in Uganda, it was mentioned in Madagascar, Malawi, Senegal, so that's in the Francophone, Mozambique, South Africa. In Mozambique and South Africa, these were actually the case studies that were highlighted, which was really great to see as well, and very important, and offered us perspective. And then Tanzania, Namibia. So it was really a very stark reoccurring theme, but you really had to be looking for it. I had an eagle eye out for it, but often it's 1 or 2 lines, because it's still a sector that we know so little about, and that we have very little data and information about. So I think there was really also a story coming forwards around informal employment, and what that had, the impact that that has on your access to kind of formal finance for housing. And I think Alison and all of the data work, increasingly also the informal employment data really hit us in the face again and again and again. How many people, and it really is the majority in nearly every African country, and how much of the workforce is informally employed, and all of the consequences that that has. And I think just one more theme maybe to pick up is something that was interesting, and I picked it up kind of on the side, was increasingly a mention in macroeconomic context, and we were kind of saying, what are the biggest developments in your country in the last year? Increasingly, we are seeing as well disasters and climate disasters. So there was mentions of floods, of storms, of cyclones in a lot of the island states that are covered, the African island states, so in the Comores and the Seychelles, in Sao Tome and Principe, in Mozambique, and then as well in other inland countries, DRC, Somalia, Libya, have all seen quite extreme natural disasters, and the reconstruction, the impact that that has had also on the housing and the need for kind of reconstruction efforts. So we're already facing a huge gap in affordable housing delivery, but then for the most vulnerable, sometimes the housing that is there is also being taken away by these natural disasters. And I think that was also the thinking around, also in the data, including kind of green indicators that over time will give us more of a story of how are we also adapting the affordable housing delivery to increasingly be able to handle and be resilient to these disasters that we are seeing increasing. So that was a very quick and wild ride across the many different profiles. Thanks.
That's great, Claudia. We are seeing some of the same themes, but I think we're also seeing changes over the 15 years. And it's been so interesting to watch, even over my span of 7 years or so, how the conversation has changed, and how informality is coming up more strongly, how the role of the private sector is also coming up, and urbanization, worrying about urbanization as well. And all of these are evidenced each year in the yearbook. And I think that's one of the massive contributions of this publication, is it serves as a thermometer each year for the main issues that are hitting the residential property markets across Africa. We have about 10 minutes. I just want to open it up for questions. There was one question from Amos in the chat around the extent to which the current economic challenges are impacting informal housing growth, as well as the supply of affordable rental. I don't know if any of the panelists want to approach that one. Are there other questions? Please put your hand up so that I might see you. I'm not seeing hands. Please, colleagues, point them out if I'm missing them. I see one other question. Okay.
And one hand from Annie.
Okay, could we take the one hand, and then we'll go back to the questions in the chat. Annie?
Hi everyone. Can you hear me all right? Thanks for the presentations. This was super interesting. I'm a PhD student at Wharton in economics, really interested in urban development, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So I was wondering, what do we know in these contexts from a data perspective about these private developers, how they're operating? I'm still sort of like familiarizing myself with it, like gathering more institutional knowledge. So how are these private developers operating in this space, considering everything that was discussed? Thank you.
That's great. I think that actually is probably a question for Kezia, because CAHF has been doing a tremendous amount of work around data with private developers. Do you want to speak to that, Kezia?
Yeah, happy to. I was just typing it actually, but we've got a program called the Open Access Initiative I mentioned in the presentation, and Alan Mutuma is the program manager of that. He's based in Kenya. So I'll put his email address in the chat. It's very difficult. In some countries, like in Kenya, you've got the Kenya Property Developers Association. You have something similar in South Africa, various different industry groupings. There's a Abuja Builders Coalition in Abuja, Nigeria. I think there's a Property Developers Association in Ghana too. Makafui, you might be able to comment on that. They don't, as far as I can see, they rarely share data about like aggregated data and detailed data. And so that's what we're trying to do, is to say, can we count you? We've got a really nice dashboard for the Nairobi metropolitan area that we've done just on the basis of what we could find on the internet, which is a map of developments in that area, about 18,000 units, I think, that my colleague Beatrice Mwangi put together. She's a research manager for East Africa. And just now I'll put that address into the chat as well. But yeah, we're thinking about it. It's difficult because the private sector is doing what they can to build, so they don't really record the data so much, but we're working on trying to collect it.
So we had the question that I read earlier, just around the impact of the economic circumstances currently on the demand for affordable rental and affordable housing. There's also a question coming from, forgive me while I try to read this, a question around the private sector and what sort of incentives they have for participating in the affordable housing space. I think we touched on this with your inputs from the panel around what is the definition of affordable housing from the perspective of private developers. And that we saw through the case studies in this year's yearbook that what is called affordable housing by the private sector is often not the sort of affordable housing target that we're thinking of when we speak about affordable housing, which is lower than that. So affordable housing tends to be what we would perhaps call more the lower middle class and the working middle class than truly low income families being targeted through affordable housing. Do any of the panelists, perhaps Makafu or James, do you want to speak at all to your perspective around the impact of the economic circumstances and also the incentives that private developers might have to enter into affordable housing?
Okay, certainly. Okay, talking of the extent to which Ghana's economic environment has influenced affordability, you realize that, looking at our GDP growth figures from the previous year to this year, we've had GDP growth decline, which is an indicator that, headwinds still persist. But that notwithstanding, government has taken the position of being enablers, in the sense that they partner with private developers to implement some of the affordable housing projects. So we had one coming up last year where government partnered a group of developers, and what government did was to provide huge tracts of land, and in this instance, government provides that security of tenure and then provides the land component. And so these initiatives come in to encourage developers to go into the affordable housing space.
Alison, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I was saying I don't think we'll be able to get to all the questions in the chat. I'm going to ask the team to try to respond in writing to some of those. We do need to wrap up, but I want to give a last chance to the panel, particularly to our representatives in Ghana and Rwanda, on what you've been involved in the yearbook process for a couple of years. What kind of impact do you see the yearbook having, or is there evidence of the yearbook having in your country in terms of impacting the residential property market, and particularly affordable housing? Has nobody heard of it, or are you starting to see that people are more aware and perhaps using the information? Or are there gaps or directions that the yearbook could go in from next year onward that would make it more valuable in your country context?
Okay, so speaking to Ghana, the yearbook has become more like a go-to source for data and information on housing, and then, in fact, the residential real estate market. And in a world where we are all looking at, devising means of promoting the transparency of the real estate market, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, the yearbook has done very well in providing very detailed data. It has become a go-to source for investors, in a way, to make preliminary decisions concerning investments in the residential real estate space. A lot of investors particularly find it useful because of figures in the mortgage space. In fact, it has boosted the transparency of the residential sector of the real estate market. So I think that, yes, the yearbook is making a lot of impact in the Ghanaian real estate market.
Are you just saying that because we like to hear it?
Not at all, not at all. In fact, if you think about it, a lot of times, if you want talk of the residential real estate market, any information at all, you find it in the yearbook. Yeah, you find it in the yearbook, and it has become that's go-to source for data pertaining to the residential real estate market.
Well, that's exactly what we like to hear. Thank you. James, your perspective? What's your sense of the usefulness of the yearbook in your country context?
Sure. Just to reiterate what my fellow panelists has mentioned, I've been given the chance, or had the opportunity, to talk to Beatrice and also Alan and hear what they're doing with the open AI access. And what you come to see is, and appreciate, is how they've broken down the elements that the developers offering from a price point perspective. You're looking into the number of bedrooms and looking into the amenities offered by these particular developers and the schemes that they offer in the market space. What you come to see is, from an investor's perspective, able to more or less analyze the value chain, that you're able to can analyze and able to see the value chain, and also see which particular bracket or which particular housing demographic should you be targeting as an investor. But also that's from an investment perspective, but also from a public player perspective, from a government perspective, is also an important avenue for them to see, hey, there's this element of the demographic that you have left uncovered. So how can we be able to support them? And also that's where maybe like in Kenya, there's what I call it public players like KIPRA, which is an economic research group, which has also entered into the property space, researching into data and all that. And also, lastly, when it comes to data, as of now, as at the current market, another important element is uncovering variables. There are a lot of variables that international players or also local players do not appreciate. So the data and the professionals in that space are able to advise and guide them on the proper way to work around these particular variables and also offer a product, offer a housing product at an ideal price point. Yeah.
Super. That's great. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. It's wonderful to get that feedback and to also hear higher level impressions. One of the difficulties with the yearbook is we get lost in the trees because of all the detail that's contained in the publication. So it's really helpful to step back and to look at what some of the trends are. What are some of the new developments, and to think about that strategically at a higher level. So this has been a great space for that. I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to all the questions. Please feel free to contact us, Kesia or Claudia or Aminata. I'm just going to give a last word to Aminata and Claudia, if there's anything else you want to add, and then we'll just wrap up. Claudia?
Sure, thank you. And just to say thank you for today. It was so great after being chained to my laptop for multiple months, lost in the trees and the weeds of every profile, to be at this moment and to be able to step back and see the contribution of the yearbook, and also have a bit of perspective to be able to untangle the trends and see the synergies between different countries. And I must say that just I see so much value in the process of the yearbook, in how it builds connections between African countries, and the ability to see, oh wow, there is precedent of what is happening in our context, in our neighboring country, or in a different country in sub-Saharan Africa, or maybe even from a different region. But that's something that I'm really passionate about, and that I think is a real driving force behind this yearbook, is that every African country has 4 pages in this yearbook, and that is a really valuable thing. And by far my favorite part of this journey was collaborating with every single author from every single country, and the conversations we were having around the data, around the profile more broadly. And that is a process that I think has a lot of value, that I hope that we can carry forward and expand even that kind of community for many yearbooks to come. And I hope that I'll see you all again next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudia. Thanks everyone for your attention and for your patience and for your also involvement in the process, because I see that also in the auditors, there are some of our authors from this year and the last years. And I wouldn't say much more than Claudia, because she said it all, because we used to say that the yearbook process is also a way to build the capacities of the authors within the African countries. But I feel like it first builds our capacities as CAHF to better understand the landscape in Africa, to better have a wider vision. I've never seen so many information from all the other countries. I've discovered a lot in these years working on the yearbook. That's why even though it's very time-consuming, it's very health, body and soul consuming, it's very interesting and nurturing as well, because it teaches us a lot, as Claudia said. And also, yeah, the exchanges with the authors, the discussions to see how to deal with also the lack of data, the lack of issues on the field and on the ground. It's very interesting and nourishing, let's say. So I would just say happy and very lucky to be part of this process. Looking forward to see how it will go in the next years, and looking forward to see a lot of changes in the countries, a lot of new debates, new discussions. And yeah, looking forward to working with also all the people who want to be involved. Thank you.
Just from my side, this yearbook was one of the smoothest processes we've had in a number of years. And I think that has a lot to do with the quality of the inputs that we received and the professionalism of the authors and their responsiveness. And also to Aminata and to Claudia and to the data team that were right on the ball the whole time, even when we were were too worn out to be there. We showed up. So I really, really appreciate that. And it makes the process so fulfilling. The story behind the yearbook is almost as fascinating as the yearbook itself, I think, in some ways. And it's such a model for continental collaboration and learning. So that's a thank you from my side. Kezia, do you want to add anything and by way of goodbye?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Alison. Thanks so much for your leadership through this. And for facilitating this discussion and letting us all reminisce about the last few months and putting it together. I can't remember if it's been told, if we've shared with the audience, that we caught the attention of South America. And they asked for our advice on how to do a yearbook similarly in South America, in Latin America. So that's very exciting. There's also interest of colleagues in East Asia to do the same thing. So it's such an honor to be included in this community with all of you, and to be able to take your ideas and put it into a publication that then CAHF can circulate, and that seems to be inspiring people and helping facilitate the conversation further. So thank you, everyone, for everything that you've put into this. We are always open for ideas and recommendations and thoughts. We have some nice plans for thinking about how to build the conversation part of the yearbook over the next year. And so we will be in touch. But thank you for joining us.